True democracy in talk radio of, for, and by you, the people. Live nationwide and streaming live at lesliemarshallshow.com. Call in with your thoughts at 888-6-LESLIE.
Tuesday, here to set you free. I'm Leslie Marshall. Welcome or welcome back to the only true democracy in talk. Thank you for listening to us on radio, on stream, on podcast, watching us on Facebook Live, YouTube Live, Twitter's Live, Periscope that you can watch the show through, and also LinkedIn Live. We have a great guest joining us in the second half of the hour. In the first half, I'm going to be doing something in just a moment, but I do want to say a couple of things here today. You know, a lot of people say that Joe Biden hasn't united us. Joe Biden hasn't united Democrats and Republicans. Joe Biden hasn't united the American people. American people can't be united by Joe Biden or anybody. We have to unite ourselves. We have to make that decision. Let me give you an example, okay? I was just on TV right before this on America Reports on Fox News Channel, where I am a Fox News contributor. Now, for those of you that watch Fox and say you have a liberal bias, you're damn right I have a liberal bias. I'm a liberal Democrat, political analyst, a Democratic strategist, and a talk show host who is paid to present the liberal point of view. So when I do that, I'm doing my job because the panel has a conservative doing their bias to the right and me, the liberal, doing my bias, if you will, to the left. 1, 2. I'm not a journalist. I was back in the day. I opine for a living. Journalists report or should be reporting the facts. People like me who analyze or strategize, we opine about the facts that are given. 3, I'm not on TV to win a beauty contest. I get so tired of all of your opinion of my hair or what, my weight is and stuff like that. Please just stop, especially women. Because, we as women have been, objectified, by, our breast instead of our brains since Adam and Eve. And I don't know about you, but in 2021, I am damn sick of it. Seriously. We are more than that. We should be more than that, ladies. And you, ladies, should never be calling out another woman for her physical appearance. Just stop. Additionally, I am of Jewish ancestry on my father's side. I am very tired about the vaccines or COVID being compared to the Holocaust. The Holocaust had over 11 million die. 6 million of them were Jews, and at the time there were 14 million Jews on the planet. So Hitler almost wiped out almost half of the Jewish people of this world. We are not wearing a yellow star, which will lead us to be put in ghettos, then be rounded up and put on trains, sent to a camp where we are gassed when we think we're supposed to be given a shower, and then burnt in an oven and sometimes alive. No, asking you to have a vaccine passport, to get a vaccine, to wear a mask is nothing like the Holocaust. Please just stop. And then lastly, I was on TV, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, talking about these vaccine passports. And I had mentioned that in 2007, I adopted my son from Pakistan. Now, most of you listen to me on radio, have read what I write. I've written about my adoption journey or watch me on TV, know this. Somebody just wrote this, and it really made me mad. I'd like to slap her in the face, but I'm a pacifist. And she basically said I was playing the victim again. Let me make it clear. Being married to a doctor, that doesn't make me a victim. Makes me very blessed because I love my husband no matter what he does. He's gorgeous. He makes a great living. He's a wonderful guy. He's a great father. And I am very blessed to live an incredibly wonderful life every day that I wake up and I'm 6 feet above ground instead of below. I am grateful. Okay? 2, adopting my son doesn't make me a victim. Are you out of your mind? It made me a mother. And that makes me truly even more blessed. My son fills my heart like no other. And I have my daughter as well, who fills the other part of my heart. That's my heart's like in, 5, positions, right? My husband, my son, my daughter, my friends, and the rest of the family. And so I just want to be clear. I'm not a victim. I'm very blessed. As a matter of fact, you're looking at white privilege, folks. I'm very blessed. So I just wanted to put all of that out there because I get tired of tweeting it and I get tired of blocking you. Oh, by the way, and if you insult me, I will block you. And if you follow me and insult me, why are you following me? And if you want to say things like, oh, Leslie Marshall's playing the victim again, whatever, talk amongst yourselves. Don't involve me. I don't have time for you because you and your negativity are polluting my very wonderful right now life. That's all. Or that's the memo, as my buddy Bill used to say. Let's get to what is rich. I want you to listen during, as you know, it's Derek Chauvin's trial this week. I want you to listen to the 911 call that was played in the court, in the trial. This is the 911 call of a witness who did call 911. Yes, called police on the police, called 911 on the officers at the scene because he believed he, quote, witnessed a murder. Take a listen.
911, what's the address of the emergency?
Officer 987 killed a citizen in front of a Chicago store. He just pretty much just killed this guy that wasn't resisting arrest. He had his knee on the dude's neck the whole time, Officer 987. The man went stopped breathing. He wasn't resisting arrest or nothing. He was already in handcuffs. They pretty much just killed the dude. I don't even know if he's dead for sure, but he was not responsible when the ambulance just came and got him. And the officer that was just out here left, the one that actually just murdered the kid in front of everybody on 36th, 38th in Chicago.
Okay. Would you like to speak with the sergeant?
Yeah, like that was bogus what they just did
Hold
to
on.
this man. He was unresponsive. He wasn't resisting arrest or any of it.
Okay, let me get you over to the desk. You can request to speak with the sergeant, okay? Stay on the
Yeah, and I'm sitting here talking to with another off-duty firefighter that just sat here and watched it in front of us as well.
Okay.
And she told him to check the man's pulse, but they wouldn't even check the pulse.
Okay, 1 second.
Powerful. Very, very powerful. And we'll continue to bring you updates here on the program as they are presented to us. Let's rip another. 67% of students who plotted school shootings had potential access to one or more firearms. That's according to a report from the Secret Service that was published today. So why does this matter? Well, the United States suffers one of the highest rates of gun violence in the world, 57 times as many school shootings as the other 6 G7 countries combined. What? That's according to reports by CNN. Now, the issue is a topic of national debate once again after a string of recent shootings in 1 week in Atlanta and then Boulder. The findings in this study, conducted by the Secret Service's National Threat Assessment Center, analyzed 100 students who plotted 67 attacks in K-12 schools nationwide from 2006 to 2018. Students who plotted attacks shared many similarities with students who perpetrated attacks. That includes histories of school discipline, bullying, mental health issues, and/or substance abuse. Now, they were often impacted by adverse childhood experience, like abuse. They were most often motivated to plan an attack due to an interpersonal conflict with a classmate or classmates. The study called on schools and communities to facilitate tangible steps for identifying and reporting concerning behaviors, especially among students themselves, who the report said are best positioned to identify warning signs from their classmates. Nearly 1/3 of plotters conducted research into prior mass attacks, with many displaying interest in the 1999 Columbine shootings, as well as Nazism and white supremacy. Many also planned attacks associated with certain dates, particularly in the month of April, that is the anniversary of the Columbine attack. About 94% of the plotters talked about their attacks. 75% were detected by authorities as a result of it. We need to listen, right? We need to listen. And we need to watch, right? The bottom line, the purpose of the study is the most comprehensive analysis of school shootings since Columbine, by the way, per Associated Press. It is not to identify students for arrest, but to recognize early warning signs so that no one falls through the cracks. In other words, prevent the shooting before it happens and perhaps help the shooter because some of them might have some issues mentally. Let's rip another. President Biden announced a slate of new actions today aimed at addressing the nation's rise in anti-Asian violence. The move comes nearly 2 weeks after deadly shootings that left 8 dead, including 6 Asian women, and after a year of Asian American Pacific Islander. The AAPI community's calls for help from the government. By the way, 150% increase in attacks against Asians since former President Trump, started calling it Kung Flu and the China virus. The new actions include a Department of Justice cross-agency initiative focused on responding to hate crimes. The DOJ will initiate community outreach to address gaps in hate crimes reporting, while the FBI will publish a new interactive hate crime page dedicated to anti-Asian hate crimes. And the DOJ updated its hate crimes website, accessible now in Chinese, Korean, Tagalog, and Vietnamese. I'm Leslie Marshall. That's what's ripped from the headlines, part 1. We'll come back with Ripped from the Headlines, part 2, right after this.
If you're worried your friend may be struggling, remember, you don't have to be there to be there.
You could say, how are you, or get a fake tattoo. You could ask with an app if it works for you. You could write them a text or knit them a sweater. If you can't be together, you could write them a letter. Whatever gets you talking. Whatever gets you talking. You could chat on the game, kick off your flip-flops. You could ask on your couch while you binge watch. However you do it, you gotta ask a friend. And if they don't share, you can ask again. Whatever gets you talking. Whatever gets you talking.
Reach out to a friend about their mental health. Learn how you can help at seizetheawkward.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and the JED Foundation.
I was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean when it happened. There was a sudden jolt and our submarine crashed on the seafloor. We were in total darkness.
That's Dr. Dejana Figueroa, a marine biologist and STEM teacher, talking about a deep sea dive she'll never forget.
It's funny, when I was a kid, I was afraid of the ocean. And there I was, 2 miles below the surface. But as a scientist, you prepare for that. Using our training and a little creativity, we fixed the sub and finished our experiments. The dive was just too important. Every dive gives us glimpses at things few people ever get to see. Glowing creatures, fiery undersea volcanoes. When we got back to the surface, I kissed the ground and called my mom, of course. But you know what? I wouldn't trade that dive for anything.
Dr. Figueroa uses her passion for STEM to discover new things and make the world a better place. She can STEM, so can you. Check out She Can STEM for more stories and inspiration. A message from the Ad Council.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1870. That was the day the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was adopted. It was the third of the Reconstruction Amendments. It prohibited voting restrictions on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Premier historian Eric Foner states that the Reconstruction Amendments reflected, quote, a newly empowered national state and the idea of a national citizenry enjoying equality before the law. These legal changes also arose from the militant demands for equal rights from former slaves themselves. The bulk of southern states refused to ratify, but then capitulated. Interestingly, New York sought and failed to revoke its earlier ratification. The amendment split the women's suffrage movement for its failure to codify women's voting rights. Some radical Republicans also abstained on the basis that it did not also prohibit poll taxes and literacy tests. Immediately, the 15th Amendment came under attack. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black voters and Reconstruction governments for years. One of the most extreme examples was the 1873 Colfax Massacre. After the Compromise of 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes refused to enforce civil rights protections. The rise of discriminatory Jim Crow laws effectively disenfranchised Southern blacks for nearly a century. Congress would finally enforce the 15th Amendment fully through the Landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, the act has come under attack most recently, as in the 2013 case Shelby versus Holder. Jurisdictions with histories of voter restrictions no longer have to obtain pre-clearance before implementing changes to voting laws and practices. Over 150 years after the end of the Civil War, African Americans are still fighting to protect their right to vote. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
If you miss Leslie on TV this week, catch up at lesliemarshallshow.com.
We are back. I'm Leslie Marshall. Welcome back. Only True Democracy and Talk. Happy Tuesday to you. A Nobel Prize winning, let's finish in our second half of Ripped from the headlines. A Nobel Prize winning economist says he not only endorses President Biden's expected $4 trillion infrastructure spending plan, but expects that it could break the U.S. out of the low growth, low inflation environment that has existed for the past 20 years. The combination of President Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief plan and the expected Build Back Better program mean that the United States may be in a very good position to get back into a more normal economy. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of Columbia University professor Joseph Stiglitz, who told Axios this in an exclusive interview. He said, quote, "We've been for the last 2 decades in an abnormal environment. We've been in a bad equilibrium trap." He went on to say, quote, "The inequality means people don't have demand. A lack of demand means we don't invest. So we've been in a very bad, vicious circle, and I'm optimistic that this may break us out into a new period of strong growth, which is more egalitarian." Here is the big picture. U.S. growth has been stuck at around 2% since 2000, averaging 2.1% a year. Now, you compare that to the country's long-run average of closer to 4%. Economists have argued about whether the growth decline is a result of increase in debt, rising economic inequality, declining investment, or other reversible trends, or is simply the consequence of an aging population and natural factors. So where does it stand? Well, if Biden's infrastructure proposal becomes law, well, who, by the way, Stiglitz, he was awarded the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics. He knows a bit more about this than me. He said, quote, "We're going to heat up the economy." He said, "We're going to be investing, spending money on education, childcare, a whole variety of expenditures across the spectrum, and not just giving money to the very rich, but giving money to people who actually spend it. That will create more demand, and that should give people more confidence to invest." Let's rip another. The next month is the most important period for the United States climate action in more than a decade, and possibly ever, longtime advocates and observers tell Axios. With scientists issuing more urgent warnings that time is running out to curtail the consequences of global warming, the policy choices proposed through the end of next month, April, could reverberate for decades to come. According to Sam Ricketts, co-founder and senior policy advisor for Evergreen Action, quote, "This is the moment those of us who work in this space have been waiting for at least a decade." Looking at the big picture, the Biden administration is moving quickly on 3 fronts to regain international credibility on this issue after the Trump White House pulled the country out of the Paris Climate Agreement. First, the White House is proposing a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure package this week that is aimed at wrapping ambitious climate policy goals into a jobs bill. Second, the administration is trying to transform the country's energy mix through regulations and executive orders, most recently yesterday with the announcement that it would seek to deploy 30 gigawatts worth of offshore electricity generation by 2013. That is higher than even the most aggressive projection from energy analysts. And third, there's the looming deadline for the State Department to formally unveil the country's new emission targets under the Paris Agreement, known as a Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. The NDC would signal to other countries how ambitious and serious the United States is about tackling climate change. Here's the intrigue. The details of the draft the NDC are closely held among the teams of Special Climate Envoy John Kerry and White House Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy. But environmental groups and some Democratic lawmakers are pushing them to be as bold as possible, possibly going as far as a 50% emissions cut compared to the 2005 levels by 2030 that is proposed now. The target that is chosen will send a message to the rest of the world, possibly spur other nations to be more ambitious in their emission cuts as well. The White House is hosting a virtual climate summit, April 22nd through the 23rd, and they're doing this to encourage other countries to make far-reaching emissions reduction plans. Quote, according to David Waskow of the World Resource Institute, quote, "This is going to be seen by the rest of the world as a key test of credibility for this administration." Quote, "There's no doubt that a strong target will both spur the economy in the United States in the right direction and bring some of the credibility in the United States that they want to have internationally." So here's what to watch. The NDC is going to serve as the strongest signal to date that the U.S. is back to take a leadership role in international climate talks, and a lackluster target, particularly for 2030, it would enable other countries, including China, to emit more planet-warming greenhouse gases than might have otherwise. So between the lines, according to the UN, the world is on track for at least 3 degrees Celsius, that's 5.4% Fahrenheit, of warming, okay? 3 degrees Celsius, 5.4 Fahrenheit of warming by 2100 if countries stick to their current Paris emissions targets. Now, scientists warn that this could cause catastrophic consequences, such as the accelerated melting of polar ice sheets. We've already seen a lot of polar bears with no ice to live on and live off of. Here's what they're saying. Reagan said he's hoping to see a clean electricity standard, and that could drastically scale up the use of solar, wind, and other energy sources implemented as part of the infrastructure bills. And said, quote, President Biden is considering all options to get the United States on the path to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. That's according to a spokesman at the State Department. And they mentioned India as a priority country for climate diplomacy, along with China. And China, as you know, is the world's top emitter. The other side, Republican lawmakers have already signaled their opposition, big surprise, to an infrastructure package that contains far-reaching climate policy provisions. According to Rep. Sam Graves, the top Republican on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, in a statement he said, quote, we simply cannot afford another Green New Deal disguised as an infrastructure bill. Yes, but while Biden is about to show his hand, a lot needs to go right for all this to succeed. The jobs bill alone could take months to pass. The razor-thin Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, well, it means the administration is going to have to hold together progressives and moderates, and that's not going to be easy, particularly on how to pay trillions in new infrastructure spending. But here's the bottom line. Rarely, if ever, has a moment like this come along with the potential to advance climate goals domestically and internationally at the same time. The administration is sprinting to cobble together a legislative program, regulatory moves, and diplomatic steps simultaneously. And that's going to be a delicate balancing act. My 2 cents, do it in pieces. It's too big to I know some people are going to disagree with me on this. I'm sorry. Do it in pieces. Do it in pieces. The price tag isn't as big if you do it that way. And then people don't say, hey, this is an infrastructure. It's a Green New Deal. And, Green New Deal, socialism, communism, open borders. Those are all big words for politicians on the right. And we have a midterm election coming up in less than 2 years. Let's rip another. Today, President Biden announced plans to nominate 11 judges to the federal courts, and that includes D.C. District Court Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to replace former D.C. Circuit Court Judge Merrick Garland. He's now the Attorney General. And let's look at this. The nominees include 3 black women, and if confirmed, could result in the first Muslim federal judge in the United States and in the history of this country, the first AAPI woman to serve on the D.C. District Court, and the first woman of color as a federal judge in Maryland, according to the White House. The selections reflect the president's deeply held conviction that the federal bench should reflect the full diversity of the American people. That was a news release from the White House. This is a president who promised to diversify his cabinet. He has to promise to do this. And you got to give credit to that. The nomination of Jackson is going to likely spur discussion about a potential nomination for the Supreme Court, because Biden said he will nominate the country's first black female justice, and the D.C. Circuit Court, to which Jackson is nominated, is often viewed as a stepping stone to the highest court. Jackson was once a clerk for Justice Stephen Breyer, the oldest justice on the Supreme Court. Maybe she'll replace him. And let's take a look at a few of the others. Zahid N. Qureshi, a magistrate judge nominee for the New Jersey District Court, would be the first Muslim. Tiffany Cunningham, a patent litigator in Chicago. She would be the first woman to serve on that court. Florence Y. Pan, a D.C. Superior Court judge, would be the first Asian American woman. And Candace Jackson Akwami, who would be the only black woman on the court's bench in the Seventh Circuit. I'm Leslie Marshall. That's what's ripped from the headlines. Coming up, our guest, more with you right after this. Don't go away.
Hey, Dad, how do airplanes fly? What's in this box? Can I touch this? Where does sand come from? Is this tree good for climbing? What happens if I mix these two things together? How are babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Storing your guns securely is the best way to prevent family fire, including unintentional shootings. For more information on safe gun storage and ways to keep your family safe, visit endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org.
What do we keep in the attic? What's this thing called? Can I ride my bike backwards?
Like I said, kids are curious. It's up to us to keep them safe. Brought to you by End Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.
Wake up and text. Text and eat. Text and catch the bus. Text and miss your stop. Wait. Text and be late to work.
Sorry, I'm late.
Text and work. Text and pretend to work. Text and act surprised when someone calls you out for not working.
Who, me?
Text and meet up with a friend you haven't seen in forever.
Hi.
Oh, hey.
Text and complain that they're on their phone the whole time. Text and listen to them complain that you're on your phone the whole time. Text and whatever. But when you get behind the wheel, give your phone to a passenger. Put it in the glove box. Just don't text and drive. Visit StopTextsStopWrecks.org. A public service announcement brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
Ralph Waldo Emerson told of a dinner guest who went on and on about the virtue of honesty, offering his own life as a model of perfect rectitude. The louder he talked of his honor, said Emerson, the faster we counted our spoons. That's my reaction to the cacophony of phony piety arising from Republican governors and legislators who are trying to enact more than 250 new state laws to stop Black, Latino, Asian American, Indigenous, and other non-Caucasian voters from casting ballots. Yet they proclaim, we're not racist, we're righteous crusaders protecting the sanctity of the vote. Really? So why are they specifically targeting people of color with their repressive voting restrictions? For example, panicky Republican lawmakers in Georgia tried to outlaw any early voting on Sundays. Odd. Why? It's a flagrantly racist attack on the black church. For years, a joyous civic tradition called Souls to the Polls has played out in Southern black churches on Sundays prior to Election Day. After the sermon and prayers, congregants, ministers, musicians, and others in the church family travel in a caravan to early voting locations to cast ballots. It turns voting into a civic, spiritual, and fun experience. What kind of shriveled soul tries to kill that? Apparently, the same shameful souls in the Georgia GOP who want to stop local groups from providing water and snacks to citizens forced to wait for hours in line to vote. They're actually trying to make it a crime to give water to thirsty voters. Hey, Republicans, what would Jesus do? This is Jim Hightower saying the goal and duty of every public official ought to be to maximize voter turnout. After all, the more Americans who vote, the stronger our democracy. But there's the ugly political truth. Republican officials no longer support democracy.
Follow Leslie on Twitter. Just go to www.twitter.com/Leslie Marshall, and we'll be sure to share your tweets.
We are back, second half of the show, and I'm very glad to have with us for the first time Damon Hewitt. Damon is acting president and executive director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. He leads one of the country's most important and long-tenured national civil rights organizations in the pursuit of equal justice for all. The Lawyers Committee seeks to promote fair housing and community development, economic justice, voting rights, equal educational opportunity, criminal justice, judicial diversity, and more. Please check out their website. Go to lawyerscommittee.org. On Twitter, follow them at LawyersComm, C-O-M-M. Damon's handle, at Damon the Hewitt, and it's kind of pushed together, Damon T. Hewitt, DAMONTHEWITT. Additionally, by the way, the Lawyers Committee powers 866-OUR-VOTE. That number is 866-OUR-VOTE. They work 365 days a year to advance and defend your right to vote. So you can call 866-OUR-VOTE with your questions about voting, any issues you have with regard to voting. The website, 866-OUR-VOTE.org. More than a pleasure to have Damon with us today. Hi, Damon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks so much for having me and for covering this important issue.
I understand that elections have consequences. And when you look at the state of Georgia, and you have a black man who becomes a senator, a Jewish man who becomes a senator, and a Democratic guy who becomes president, and the other two are also Democrats, Republicans worry. There is legislature in the state of Georgia that has been passed, SB 202, that many people, even some on the right, feel is not just unconstitutional, but it goes too far, such as not being able to give food and water to people in areas, to have drop boxes removed from specifically areas where people of color, even more specifically African Americans, live. And especially when you see those numbers, because African Americans turned Georgia blue without question when you look at the exit poll and the numbers, and especially African American women. There are lawsuits coming out right now, right? There's a federal lawsuit that says Georgia's SB 202 is a culmination of concerted efforts to suppress the participation of Black voters and other voters of color. There are those on the right who would say everything that comes out, we on the left bring up the race card and we cry race. In this instance, there is no question that this is voter suppression. Would you agree? And can you please speak to that?
Well, thank you, Leslie. Of course, this is voter suppression. Not only is it voter suppression, but it's at the intersection of race and racial discrimination. And that's why at the Lawyers Committee, on behalf of Georgia-based organizations, we did file a lawsuit Sunday night alleging not just that this happens to have a negative or disparate impact on Black voters, brown voters, but also that it is an intentionally discriminatory policy. The whole shebang, this entire statute, is intentionally discriminatory on all fronts because we know that it's not happenstance that these retrogressive, backwards going restrictions are designed to stamp out the increased voter participation that we saw nationwide and also in Georgia in 2020. But also we know that Black and brown and even Asian voters are a growing part of the electorate. So this isn't just about today. This is about a long game in terms of what this legislation is designed to do to frustrate democracy before it even has a chance to breathe.
Well, first of all, the legislation, although we'll talk about the targeting, but just at face value, this law threatens the right of all voters in Georgia.
That's
not
right.
just minority communities, not just in communities of color, correct?
That's right. But when you think about whether a policy is discriminatory, now this isn't saying XYZ person is a racist or is not a racist. That's right. Not the analysis. We're talking about a legal analysis about whether a policy is discriminatory. And so to do that, courts will look to all of the various indicators, and context matters. And when you think about the context, listen, when you think about the growing electorate, when you think about where the long lines happen to be, and also when you think about the legacy and the history, we've said that this is really straight out of the Jim Crow playbook for voter suppression. The first thing you do is make it as hard as possible to vote and encumber ballot access. The second thing you do is you criminalize normal community behavior, like handing someone a bottle of water because they're in the long line because you made it hard to vote. But then the third thing that happens, Leslie, is that there are officials who say, oh, no, this is just fine. This is facially neutral. This is to preserve the purity and integrity. This is straight out of the Jim Crow playbook. I mean, you can rewind the clock 50, 60 years and you see really the similar provisions, but just updated, frankly, for the modern context.
Oh, absolutely. Because the most new, you pointed out some of them. It is absolutely clear, you can't make this stuff up. It is absolutely clear that in this law, the most negative impacts will be felt by communities that are specifically being targeted by this legislation. And the reason is, if you look at the map and you look at where the ballot boxes are being taken from, if you look at the map and you look at, and not just that, I saw on TV, most of us saw, especially in Georgia, because that election, was separate. When you saw the long lines, overwhelmingly African Americans were standing in line. And you see that throughout many states in this country, because there may be less voting locations where they live. And so there are more people going to that one location, and they're standing in hours. And I give them kudos. I'm impatient. I complain if I'm in line 30 minutes. And it's just an act of humanity to hand somebody a bottle of water. The bottle doesn't say Biden or bust on it.
It sure doesn't, right? Voting is the most nonpartisan, pure democratic activity, lowercase d, that you could ever have, but it's been politicized. And so who's being caught in the middle, frankly, are voters of color. And also, look, this does impact rural voters as well, especially who will have to drive longer distances. But I think the intent here is clearly to choke out the lifeblood of democratic participation, civic participation in these more densely populated areas that tend to be blacker and browner.
And also ID, right? A lot of people say,
Right.
elderly people don't first of all, so many people don't have licenses. So let's just elderly people, some handicapped people, homeless people, and of course, poorer people,
That's
right?
right.
Poor, and not that all poor people take, in a city like New York, for example, but, in areas of Georgia, the people who don't have the car and that are taking public transportation, that are taking buses, to get to their place of employment, overwhelmingly, are not rich white folk. And this law specifically, without question, I agree, targets. Also, to be brought up in this, the Republican-led Georgia state legislature not only passed the anti-democratic SB 202 in order to suppress, in order to obstruct voter turnout statewide, but they originally, Republican Georgia state legislator, passed the original laws.
That's right. That's right. I mean, there's a compounded effect here, and I think that's all part of the context that really does matter. You don't have to look very far to see what was happening here. In fact, it's pretty blatant and patent. I think that the unique overreach, or somewhat unique overreach, of the criminalization, right, of voter support activity, not being able to hand someone a bottle of water, I think that's kind of the icing on the cake made of what. Quite frankly, I think that's one of the pieces that's going to put it over the top, we hope, in the eyes of a federal court in the lawsuit that we filed. And also, we think in the court of public opinion. I mean, you have none other than Lindsey Graham, senator out of South Carolina, who said, look, it doesn't make much sense to me that you can't do something like that. And so we want the lawsuit that we filed and other lawsuits that I'm sure will come are designed not just to make a difference in Georgia, but frankly, to put all of these other state legislatures on notice while all of these other bills are being considered and they're racing forward, that we're here and we're not going anywhere, and we won't let this happen quietly just because your party may have a majority or a supermajority in your both houses of your legislature in your state and even in the governor's mansion. That doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. And I would say, Leslie, I don't want to get ahead of you too far here, but this is exactly why. This is Exhibit A, this legislation as to why we need federal congressional intervention, why we need the statute known as the bill known as the For the People Act, which will help with basic election administration. And it's frankly why we need the bill that's to come, which is the John Lewis Voter Rights Restoration Act, because we need to be able to stop these kinds of laws in their tracks. If you rewind the clock a decade ago, or not even quite a decade ago, we had a provision in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Section 5, they call it the pre-clearance provision, where jurisdictions that have this kind of context and this horrific, racially polarized, racist history of discrimination in voting, that all of these jurisdictions had to get these kinds of changes, the ID, the changing of poll locations, the limitations on ballot access, the criminalization of normal conduct. These things had to be pre-cleared by the U.S. Department of Justice or approved by a federal court. The U.S. Supreme Court gutted that provision of the Voting Rights Act. And without it, that's what paved the way for all of the nonsense we're seeing, not just in Georgia, but the playbook being followed nationwide. This is, again, Exhibit A as to why we need to restore these rights and, frankly, make them stronger than they ever were in the first instance.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. We're going to take a break, but I'm glad that you mentioned that because a lot of people think this is unconstitutional. It's not the federal government telling you how to run your elections. It's just having somebody at the top keeping you in check to prevent exactly what we are talking about with SB 202. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with our guests. We'll be back with you right after this. Don't go away.
America, your children have an amazing superpower. They can help save lives by not having play dates. That's right. By replacing get-togethers with virtual play dates and video chats, they can help slow the evil spread of germs. And if your superheroes do go outside, make sure they continue their superhero wing by staying 6 feet away from others to protect everyone in America land. Find out more at coronavirus.gov. A message from the CDC and the Ad Council. America, your children have an amazing superpower. That's right. They can help save lives by simply washing their hands. Just 20 seconds of thorough hand washing after they've coughed or sneezed or been outside can help fight against the dastardly spread of germs. Armed with only soap and water and hands, your superhero can protect you, your family, and everyone out there in America land. Amazing! Find out more at coronavirus.gov. A message from the CDC and the Ad Council.
He was the heart of your family, and he taught you our history. He helped you fix your first flat. He was the best backyard DJ around, and every time he'd tell a story, he'd own the room. But now more than ever, he may feel alone. Today, older adults and their loved ones are struggling to connect, in a time when connection has never been more important. But there is something we can do. Embrace our older loved ones through StoryCorps Connect. With StoryCorps Connect, you can honor seniors remotely with an interview about their life. Every interview will be archived at the Library of Congress, becoming part of American history, so that years from now, future generations can listen in.
All right, Grandpa, what's one piece of advice you have for me?
Just 3 words, sweetheart. Live with courage. The man that had the best stories still has plenty of stories to tell. So connect virtually and share the conversation of a lifetime at storycorpsconnect.org/AARP. Connect, honor, share. StoryCorps Connect.
Welcome to Code WAC, your podcast on America's broken healthcare system and how Medicare for All could help. I'm your host, Brenda Gazar. How was the Affordable Care Act hampered in recent years? Jim Kahn, an emeritus professor of health policy at the University of California, San Francisco, gives us his take.
The Affordable Care Act, while it certainly has its limitations, did improve our situation for healthcare in the United States, and many of those improvements were reversed by the Trump administration. Although they couldn't undo the act entirely, they were able to cripple it in certain ways. So we came into the COVID pandemic with an already re-injured healthcare system, if I can say that. And as it was limping along came COVID. And what we realized is that, first of all, the people who needed the protection of stable health insurance often lost it because they lost their jobs. And as everyone knows, in the United States, health insurance is often linked to employment. So when people were laid off because companies had to close because of COVID, they were out of luck with regards to their insurance. Second issue is that some of the COVID-specific benefits that were promised, such as care without cost sharing for COVID and free testing, turned out in practice those things didn't always happen. For example, someone with diabetes or congestive heart failure came in and had COVID, and a determination was made that the reason they were sick wasn't due to the COVID. It was due to their other condition.
Get the full Code WAC story on progressivevoices.com and on the PV app. Catch all our episodes by subscribing to Code WAC wherever you find your podcasts. This podcast is powered by Heal California, a nonprofit that uplifts the voices of those fighting for healthcare reform around the country. Until next time, stay healthy.
If you miss Leslie on TV this week, catch up at lesliemarshallshow.com.
And we are back with Damon Hewitt, Acting President and Executive Director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. The website, as I said, is lawyerscommittee.org. On Twitter, @LawyersComm, COMM, and Damon's handle is @Damon T. Hewitt, DAMONTHEWITT. And once again, the Lawyers Committee powers 866-OUR-VOTE. Call them 365 days a year to ask questions and understand your rights as a voter. That's 866-OUR-VOTE, their website, 866-OUR-VOTE.org. Damon, thank you for holding. Welcome back. We're talking about Georgia's SB 202 legislation that passed, and even some conservatives are shaking their heads as to what this means. Damon, you must have read my mind in the last segment, because one of the questions I was going to ask you is the precedent this could set, this lawsuit, with Georgia. And I think it will have a domino effect legally because there are other states that are trying to copy, especially red states that Joe Biden flipped, like Arizona is one example, that want to copy this. And I want to be clear, this is not just the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. Listen to the backing and listen to the diversity of the backing. Their co-counsel is Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed. And this federal lawsuit that was fired on behalf of the Georgia State Conference of the NAACP, Common Cause, the Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda, Inc., the Galileo Latino Community Development Fund, Incorporated, the League of Women Voters of Georgia, and the Lower Muskogee Creek Tribe. Native Americans, Hispanics, women, African Americans, and whites, all coming together to say this is wrong. And what is happening legally is the group is suing to block voters' restrictions that are included in this legislation, SB 202, that was signed into law just days ago by Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. Specifically, and David, I want to ask you about this. Your lawsuit names as defendants Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, Rebecca Sullivan, David Worley, Matthew Mashburn, An Lay, in their official capacities as members of the Georgia State Election Board. Why was that important to include?
Well, because these are the officials, Leslie, that are tasked with implementing this legislation. So if the court is to enjoin or stop something from happening or require something positive to happen, it has to be vis-a-vis those officials. Specifically, it wouldn't be the legislature itself, although we know that the legislature and the governor's mansion office, rather, are the epicenter of the problem here.
And so people may not know. A lot of people know about the water and the food. People know about removing ballot boxes. People know about ID. Those are the three that get the most attention. But doesn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't SB 202 remove the voting power of the Secretary of State on the State Elections Board and allows that State Elections Board to take over county election boards so that it would give State Election Board unprecedented authority to target jurisdictions with a large population of voters of color, especially the African American community?
That's right. It's such an oddity, Leslie, and this is high level politics, right? This is literally a takeover or a threatened takeover, county by county of the apparatus to make sure it works in the interests of one party and one party alone, and not one party versus another party, but one party versus the people. Quite honestly, and what we've been hearing out of this particular defendant, the Secretary of State, and his assigns, is that they're not particularly worried. They're not concerned. And I think it's really a warning to us that all of the energy and consternation we heard during the 2020 election season, people who thought that the former president had went overboard, and certainly obviously did, that they need to keep that same energy when it comes to protecting voters this go around. It's not just about one president who went way too far. This is about a process that is being hijacked by partisan interests. And whether people of your party or not, it doesn't matter. We can't be complicit in this kind of a takeover. And so it's appropriate and ironic that you'd have the Secretary of State named as a defendant.
Absolutely. You had said, Damon, quote, Georgia state lawmakers are making it more difficult to vote, criminalizing ordinary voter assistance and lying to their own constituents to suggest it is for their own good. You say, and go on to say, by limiting access to absentee ballots and early voting, they are targeting communities of color who are a growing part of the state's electorate. These actions show that discriminatory voter suppression is alive and well, and it cannot stand. I'm going to go out on a limb. Is this white man fear? Because whites will not be the majority in 2054. And what we're seeing in Georgia is going to happen more. Lindsey Graham, you had mentioned, Lindsey Graham alluded to that. And he said, he said, if we continue to go down this road, we, meaning Republicans, will never be in control again.
Well, I think that's what it's about, power, right? And it's about who has, not just who has votes, but who has a voice, who has vitality, who has the right to have any kind of power over your own lives and your own government, your own communities. And so I think this is really, we keep thinking it's the last gasp, right, Leslie? But there's a lot of gasps here that we see through this legislation and through the power grabs and the efforts to overturn, frankly, the valid results of eligible votes from the 2020 election. This is about power. And I won't assign the power to a specific race or gender. the power grab. But what I will say is that, because look, this could shapeshift over time, right? But I think there is a very sorry legacy of, I think, at the epicenter anti-Black racism in any other community of color who gets in the way of this power, right? And I think that's what I'm focused on is the anti-Blackness, the anti-community of colorness, the anti-voter approach that we're seeing here, all in the interest of maintaining some modicum of last gasps of power.
Helen Butler, who's executive director of the Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda, said, quote, "It is unfortunate that Georgians were lied to because some did not like the results of the 2020 elections. However, passing legislation that gives the majority party too much control over our elections while also creating barriers to voters in a rushed and non-transparent process is not the solution to those lies. Our focus is protecting Georgians' right to vote, and that is why we have taken this necessary step." Will there be other lawsuits, like by the ACLU, et cetera, and does that help your suit having others file as well?
Well, look, we're not privy to other litigation strategies, but the degree of anger, the degree of agita, and the degree of appropriate and compassionate concern, I think every community that is impacted should be speaking up. Every community throughout the state, every community throughout the country, to stop some of these laws in their tracks. So it's certainly, a crowded field, so to speak, in terms of there being multiple lawsuits, but that doesn't mean that the voices are not righteous. I will tell you one differentiator for the lawsuit we have filed is that we are claiming that there's discriminatory intent, not just discriminatory impact here. And so that sets that suit apart. Others may claim the same and follow on litigation. But I would say, I can't tell you what the other organizations will do for sure. That's their decision. But we do hope that they support the litigation that exists. So just because you haven't filed a lawsuit doesn't mean your communities or your organization's voice should not be heard. In fact, we want to lift up all voices and make it loud enough so that somebody, the courts or other policymakers, will actually listen.
Is intent more difficult to prove from your legal expertise?
Well, of course, intent is always more difficult to prove. I mean, I think that we have been in this society overall socialized to presume that racial discrimination is something of the past. I think the last year in particular, and certainly the protracted moment of the last several years, consistent with the movement for Black lives, fights on other issues like immigration, Me Too even, have caused an awakening. It's shifted public discourse, and I hope it's also shifted public consciousness. But certainly the doctrinal law, it's more difficult to prove. But I will say again, one advantage of an intent claim is that it's not just about the numbers of, does it happen to have a disproportionate numerical impact on one community than the other? It allows us, Leslie, to bring in the important context, because I think this is key. I think so many people look for the smoking gun. Did someone use allegedly racist language? Did somebody, harbor racism in their hearts? That's not the analysis. The analysis is when you look at all the factors, is there any way to explain what's happening besides it being discriminatory? Is there any way? Go ahead. Yeah.
No, you go.
Yeah. Are there other common sense factors that stand on their own? And frankly, there are not. This law, SB 202, and a lot of the other laws, these are bad solutions in search of non-existent problems. They are not designed to solve for anything. They're simply designed to choke out democracy.
Well, I think intent is, although hard to prove, easier to prove when you show that the law is clearly a way to discriminate against minority and poor voters in Georgia. And also when you just look at the Black and brown communities, make it harder for those communities to vote. And I think you have enough evidence to do that right there. We have less than 60 seconds. I want to give you the last word.
Well, this is just the tip of the iceberg, Leslie. What we see in Georgia is just the tip of what we will likely see around the country. We don't welcome this legislation, but we welcome the fight. And we think that this is creating a moral clarity in this country that will help members of Congress see, including the erstwhile majority in Congress, understand why we need federal congressional intervention to protect the voting rights of ordinary citizens, especially those who are facing this kind of discrimination.
And that John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Thank you, Damon. You were great, and we will definitely have you back. Awesome job. Awesome job on the show today. Thank you. The website for the Lawyers Committee is lawyerscommittee.org. On Twitter, follow them at LawyersComm, C-O-M-M. Damon's handle at Damon T. Hewitt, D-A-M-O-N-T-H-E-W-I-T-T. And remember that 866-OUR-VOTE number. You can call with voting questions and issues 365 days a year. Go to their website if you want more info, 866-OUR-VOTE. .org. It's got a lot of information. I've been there. I've learned a thing or two. You can as well. Thank you, Damon. And thank you, Mark Romaldi, our executive producer. Everybody have a great week. I'm going on vacation Friday.